Okay. Uh, I was going to say this morning, which it is for me at the moment. Yeah, I've completely lost all sense of time and space. This is must be must be what it is to be like to be a light particle. You're both a wave and a particle. I guess that's the point, right? You can be a quantum. I'm a quantum particle. Oh, Jesus. Okay. Enough of all this dramatics, Blackmore. Get to the get to the point. Okay, so the music we're doing today, I thought was fitting in front of "Go Tell the Spartans" because this is Merle Haggard's famous "Okie from Muskogee," and this is still the anthem of much of Middle America. And when I say Middle America, I mean literally America that is in the middle. This is what we now recognize as basically the Trump support. Trump supporters generally are likely to come from Ohio, Utah, Indiana, Idaho, and then of course Arizona. The other more evangelical states, but there's this very, very strong support from the so-called flyover states. In the 60s, this "Okie from Muskogee" became the anthem of essentially the hawk, what Nixon was to call the silent majority. That is, he believed there were people who didn't get out to demonstrate, and yet they voted, and they represented more than the demonstrators, was the argument. The demonstrators basically made a lot of noise. So now I'm talking about the student demonstrators on campus. Again, you remember I talked about the Northeast and the West, right? So California, specifically San Francisco, which is really where the student movement was the strongest, mostly because of the big UCLA Berkeley campuses and so on. And the Northeast, so the Boston, New York, elite, New Jersey elite schools, and the Ivy League schools, which had become resistant to the war. Okay, so to go back to the lyrics for a moment here, so the reason I posted this particular, he went on doing this song, became, as I say, not only an anthem, but it became a huge hit for him. And you have to sort of love the irony of all these sort of apparent straight cut C&W guys who are going out and getting blasted on any number. They're all alcoholics and they're all probably snorting cocaine, but they're not smoking marijuana, which was considered to be a real gateway drug. It still is considered to be a gateway drug to heroin. I mean, people still believe that. It's like wine will make you, if you're going to become an alcoholic, starting to drink wine will make you an alcoholic. It's like, no, I don't think so. So the same thing, smoking some weed is going to make you into, a heroin addict. So we don't take our trips on LSD. And then there's the draft card burning issue, because one of the ways that the students showed their resistance was they would get a draft induction notice, and they were supposed to register. So getting a draft induction notice didn't mean you were going to be taken. It meant that you had been called up, and you could be called at any time. And sometimes they waited a year, and sometimes they waited a week. So you didn't know what was going to happen. But you had to go and register for the draft, and you get this induction notice, or vice versa. It depends on. Sorry, I'm hazy as to now which you got first. I can look it up, but basically you had to register with the government, and you became of draft age, or you were of draft age. The government said, okay, you need to register. You'd go and register for the draft. You were given a draft card which indicated your status, and whether your eligibility for the draft. 1A meant you were going, and 4F meant you weren't. And that was true in World War II and Korea as well. So there were levels of medical deferment and so on. But 1A meant prime, young, healthy, and could be you were the right candidate for boot camp, because what happened with the Selective Service Act is they began to say, okay, we'll have a random lottery of people who were elites, basically, and whoever is selected will go. So there's this real roll of the dice, basically. This was later, because what happened was they were like, wait a second, if we draft all of these kids from university who have had, say, 2 or 3 years of college, they're going to argue with us, they're going to debate with us, they're going to resist, we're going to get them into boot camp, and it's going to be one big long disaster, because we're going to have to weed out all these people who are just going to say they're going to be, as they came to be called in the Soviet gulags, refuseniks. They're going to be people who just say, I refuse, like, I'm not doing that. And they were like, well, your campmates won't be very happy. And the campmates were like, we support them, yeah, they say no, we say no. And so you'd get a mutiny. So when they realized, wait a second, they were about to draft hundreds of thousands, potentially, of debating, complaining, well-educated, articulate white liberals, they were like, wait a second, that's not good for us. So actually they backed off that. Anyway, but the way you indicated that you were against this was you went and you publicly burned your draft card. So you would say, I am so-and-so, and then you would burn your draft card. So that became a way of there's this passive resistance, right? That's what Martin Luther King's passive resistance looked like. And then basically if they came for you and said, well, we're putting you in jail, you'd be like, put me in jail. Okay. We don't make a party out of lovin'. That's the issue there, is that the hippies were having love-ins and be-ins. And it's the kind of thing where John Lennon, as you know, famously was in bed with his wife Yoko Ono, and they staged a love-in, and they invited the press in basically to see them in bed, and they were like, we're not we're going to have a love-in, we're not, and it was it worked. I mean, people took people loved that. It drove lots of people nuts, but the press loved it, and it sold a lot of papers. It's like, oh boy, two naked people on the in bed on it. Oh wow, this is the best news. Click. So there were these love-ins and be-ins, and basically it was sort of part of the free love movement, which was the end of the sex only during marriage and only after marriage, really. And all the other stuff that sort of went along with the consensus that had come from World War II. So this was part of breaking that down, and having the free love movement basically was good for men, typically. A lot of this stuff was good for men, not so good for women. The pill, remember that the birth control pill was now becoming widely available, and that meant that women were no longer reliant on men to put on a condom, or their promises that they would withdraw during sex before ejaculation. It's like, well, who the hell knows what people are going to do. So women could begin to take control of their reproduction, basically their reproductive lives. And that didn't really work so well yet, because these were the pill. This was an early version of the pill, and it was also very bad for women. I mean, it caused all kinds of other problems. It caused blood clot problems, and it killed people. And it was, it was like, it was a start, but it wasn't so this was the beginning of the breaking of consensus, and the free love movement came with it. So what he says, we don't make a party out of lovin'. And then there's this, we like holding hands and pitch and woo. So this is completely, I don't know if anybody over maybe my age, except unless you're my age or older than dirt, actually no, or maybe if you're from the South, this still makes sense. But pitch and woo is like you actually you go around and court somebody, and like you take your guitar and play some soft music for serve somebody, and and then give them play them compliments, take them a box of chocolates, and we don't do that anymore. I don't think there's a lot of pitch and woo on Grindr, not Snapchat, but what is the other? The various different dating sites, dating and or sex sites, hookup sites. Not a lot of pitch and woo there, so that's what that is. And then we don't let our hair go long and shaggy. Not unlike this actually, but men began to wear their hair long, and the argument was that this was a complete anathema. It really pissed people off. It was really great. I mean, all you had to do was grow your hair a little long, and people were like, "Oh, you're a long hair," and that's what actually people would say. It's like, "You're a long hair." So it was considered to be visible rebellion by men because they were like, "Yeah, well, like the hippies out in San Francisco do." Okay, so here he's specifically focusing on San Francisco and pointing to it as being the sort of center of the the politics of resistance from the young folks. And as I say, as I talked about before, the breaking of consensus was going to have these three main key players that are going to be very visible, right? The students of all genders and races, the African American liberation movement, for want of a better set of words, and the women's movement. Now, if people say to me, what about the queer LGBT community? It's like, yeah, absolutely. The Stonewall riots in New York it was incredibly important. But remember, and also in San Francisco, which both of these had relatively huge out populations. Or in Greenwich Village in New York, it was you could safely be out, as safe as it was to be out and queer and male. The lesbian community was a lot quieter about this. And live in a queer community with that. I mean, you didn't leave because if you left, the likelihood of violence or trouble was just very high. And in San Francisco came to be known as had been since the 50s, really, in the beatnik movement, a center of queer politics and support, and so, which is why AIDS was so tough on these two communities, because it just decimated them. So the Stonewall riots in New York are famous riots for basically the queer population, the male queer population, saying we will not go away. And so this is the famous "We're here, we're queer, get used to it" sort of chants came from them. So all this stuff is beginning to roll and is happening, and this song is against it. I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee. So these are Oklahoma. These are the people from Oklahoma. And now, if you were ever forced to read Grapes of Wrath, or you elected to read Grapes of Wrath in some cases, by John Steinbeck, he follows the migrant farm, or not migrant farmers, but he follows the Dust Bowl farmers who were literally basically blown off the land pretty much because during the Dust Bowl in the 30s, not only was there a global depression, but even worse, when the Oklahoma farmers and farmers in the Midwest generally, that includes Idaho and Utah and these other agrarian communities, which were not manufacturing communities, right? They were family farms. Well, there were drought years, and during those drought years, basically, hundreds, thousands, I guess. I haven't looked at this in a long time. Can't remember the numbers, but of tons of topsoil just blown off the land, very simply because there was drought and the land dried out and the corn died and everything died. And the topsoil just blew away. And there were calculations about how much topsoil blew away, but basically they sort of lost a generation of farmers. Just got blown. So as a result, the Okies, as they were called, can be called, and they call themselves. It's not really a derogatory term so much as it's descriptive. Tends to be descriptive, like the Hoosiers in Indiana. Although that's but it's descriptive. Began to move because they had to live somewhere. So they began to move, and they got in their Tin Lizzies, as they call them, which is the Fords that were still running, because that's all they could afford, literally. So Fords that had been probably built in the 20s, which were now 15 years old, in the mid 30s, and they went to California, mostly because California was still green. There was no drought in California. And they became migrants, and they became they weren't the first, but they became early 20th century migrant labor, where they had they lived in their cars, basically, or they lived, with the car, and they camped, and they were farmers, right? So these are the Okies. So he says, I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee. Okay. Where even the squares can have a ball. So there's the separation of people into the hippies and the squares. Are you a hippie, man? Are you cool? Are you a square? Where you remember in Pulp Fiction, Quentin Tarantino's second film, right? Second film, yeah. Where Uma Thurman says, are you a square? And she draws it out in the little animation, Daddy-O, and that goes back again to the 50s, where a square was like, actually, I think it goes back earlier. I think that black African-American jazz musicians often referred to people who weren't didn't get any of this stuff, were just squares. Now, this is interesting, right? We still wave Old Glory down at the courthouse. Well, not anymore, ideally. Like we hope to never see Old Glory again. So this is the Confederate battle flag. The red standard with the blue cross on it, with the white stars in the center, which was for a long, long time in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and so on, flown as an understood sign of white supremacists. So if you posted Old Glory at your store and you were of color, you didn't go in. If you're in the South, let's say in Florida, so terribly racist. We were like, but Florida's a nice place to visit. It's like, unless you're a person of color, and you don't go into some parts of Florida still. That's true for a lot of places, unless it's just dangerous, right? But if you saw Old Glory flying, keep on moving. If you saw Old Glory flying in a town, it's like, keep on trucking. Okay, and white lightning is still the biggest thrill of all. White lightning is moonshine. So the biggest thing you're going to do this sort of calls up your war with the revenuers, the revenue agents who were coming looking for illegal stills in the 30s. It's like, so there's this throwback to the wonderful great days of, poverty, and the leather boots are still in style for manly footwear. Beads and Roman sandals won't be seen. Okay, so beads and Roman sandals, this is more of the hippie gear, basically, that you wore, love beads, as they were called, which is usually some kind of appropriated beads from, like, I don't know. They might be from any number of different cultures. People just took from wherever. What often happened was the Beatles were very influential in this, because they had gone to South Asia and come back with, wearing the jalaba. Well, so they wouldn't have been jalabas, but sort of the white. I'm sorry, I do not know the name of the official, not the dishdasha, because that's also Middle Eastern. But the sort of white cotton shift that often was worn in very hot countries. by men, and with beads, which were called love beads. And they came back with things like prayer beads and worry beads, as they were called, where sort of men had these, everybody really, but mostly men had these beads that you, sort of like a rosary kind of, but you sort of would flip, and often made of carved stones, often made of, and Roman sandals, otherwise known as Jesus sandals, sometimes Jesus jumpers. Oh man, I heard everything. But the idea was that sandals worn by Christ. So men began to look like Christ. Like they grew these beards, and not too long, right? They grew sort of short beards, and they grew long hair, and they wore these white shifts, and people were like, it looks like there were a bunch of Christ walking around. Well, a lot of this came from the Beatles. The very end of when they were together, and they came back and did, before they did things like Magical Mystery Tour, but a lot of that's in Sgt. Pepper. There are songs like Within You and Without You, which were sort of influenced by Buddhism of one kind or another. Okay. Football's still the roughest thing on campus, so this refers to the campus riots. So it's a good old-fashioned, go play football and be abused by the coach. And the kids here still respect the campus dean, I think it is, the college dean, yeah, right. Okay. So that's the anthem of the center of the country, still very much beloved by the center of the country.